Now we turn to our second period in the Casket Empty study, the story of Abraham. As I tell this story, I might slip between calling him Abraham and Abram. These two names refer to the same man. It's just that the Lord changes his name halfway through the story I'm about to tell. For clarity, I've decided to use the name Abraham, except when I'm doing a direct quote from Bible verses that use the name Abram. The same thing happens with his wife Sarai and Sarah. Both refer to the same woman. As we've already learned, God's story of redemption started in the Garden of Eden. God made a promise after the fall. Genesis 3:15 tells us that the offspring of Eve will crush the head of the serpent that deceived Adam and Eve, while the serpent will strike his heel. We find the story of Abraham in Genesis right after the Tower of Babel story. This is a definite transition point here in the Bible. The focus changes from the story of the beginnings of mankind to focus on the story of the nation of Israel. The story starts with a genealogy, of course, but genealogies show us how the path to redemption to Jesus goes through Abraham, starting with Seth, the son of Adam, progresses to Noah in 10 generations. Then from Noah's son Shem, the path progresses to Abraham, also in 10 generations. Let's review some of the characteristics of genealogies that we've already discussed. A genealogy shows us that the stories in Genesis involve real people. These are people who have parents and children and live in a specific time and place. Today, if I need to prove who I am, what do? I might give my full name, my age, and where I live. I'll probably have to give my full address and the name of my wife. If the government's involved, I may need to show a driver's license or give my social security number. How do we know that Abraham was a real person? Well, we know the name of his father, Terah, and his grandfather, Nahor, and all the rest of his ancestors. They lived in a specific place, Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia, before they moved to the land of Canaan. We know the name of his wife and how they lived. These are not mythological people. These are real flesh and blood people. Secondly, genealogies show us that God has a plan, and he's willing to let that plan work out over a very long period of time. It shows his commitment to man's redemption in that he persists in this work not only over many years, but many hundreds or even thousands of years. And finally, genealogies are rich in information that is critical to our understanding of God's story of redemption. We're here today to talk about why Abraham is a key figure in God's plan of redemption. Now, there are so many things that we could look into about the life of Abraham, but we're going to concentrate on two aspects of his life. The first is Abraham's place in the history of redemption, and in a second video, we'll talk about Abraham's faith and righteousness. What do we know about Abraham? Let's review the call to Abraham from the 12th chapter of Genesis. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." When we are first introduced to Abraham's wife, Sarah, the very first thing that we learn is that she was barren and had no child. Now, when we studied creation, we discussed the idea that children are a blessing from God, and being barren represents a curse. Yet God promises Abraham that he will be a great nation and a great blessing. Now, at the time that he was called by God, Abraham was already 75 years old. He and his wife were probably past normal childbearing years anyway, but this is vital background information to the story. How is Abraham supposed to father a great nation? And what does it mean that the families of the earth will be blessed through him? Now, this is not the only time that God makes his promise to Abraham. After Abraham and his brother's son Lot separate, God tells Abraham that he is giving him the land of Canaan to him and his descendants forever. His offspring will be as the dust of the earth, which no one can number. But as of yet, Abraham has no son. Later, God visits Abraham again. Let me read a paragraph from Genesis chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. But Abram says, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram continued, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. The word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look towards the heavens and number the stars if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. But as of yet, Abram has no son. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appears to him again. He said, I am the Lord God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make a covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Here he gives Abraham the covenant of circumcision. Then God says to Abraham, As far as your wife Sarai, you shall not call her Sarai anymore, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face, and he laughed to himself, saying, Shall a child be born to a man who is over 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a son? But Abraham responds with obedience anyway to the new covenant. But as of yet, Abram has no son. Later, God appears to Abram by the oaks of Mamre, and he asks where Sarah is, and then promises, When I return to you next year, Sarah will have a son. Sarah overheard from inside the tent and laughed to herself that she is too old and worn out to have a child. God responds, Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, and about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. And Abraham and Sarah had a son, Isaac. His name means laughter. If we review this story, we see that God promised Abraham that he would have a son, and Abraham believed that God keeps his promises. Did this mean that God promised that he would do it right away? No. Abraham had to wait for God's time. God continued to be present in Abraham's life, and still Abraham waited. We know that this was very hard for him to wait, and yet God was faithful, finally fulfilling his promise when Abraham was 100 years old, giving him his son Isaac. It strikes me that God often works this way, waiting until there is no possible way that any man can take credit for what God does. I believe that God waited until there was a point where it became obvious that this son, Isaac, is the result of a miracle. We refer to Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob as the patriarchs of Israel. From this small, miraculous family come the people of Israel, fulfilling the prophecy of God that he will make a great nation of the descendants of Abraham. God promises that he will fulfill his intention to redeem the world through the descendants of Abraham. and these promises to the patriarchs are the foundation of the story of Israel in the Old Testament. A key thing to remember is that the promises of God to the patriarchs could only be accomplished by God, since the wives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all barren. Only by miracles do the people of Israel exist. So we see from the start of the working of God's redemption that it is indeed a miraculous process. God continued to do this work through the sons of Abraham, through such people as Joseph, Moses, King David, and finally to the great son of David, our Redeemer, Jesus. So maybe it's no coincidence that Jesus was heralded into his ministry by a prophet who was the son of a barren woman, John the Baptist.